Hi, this is Carl Raschke, and I'm here today to talk about David Chittister's theory of triple mediation, particularly as it applies to the rise of religious studies as a field and the practice and doctrine of colonialism. What I want to do here is work off an article that appeared in the journal Religions in March of 2019. And in that article, I make the case that Chittister, along with other post-colonial theorists, such as Kelly Mbembe, Tomoko Mazazawa, and Walter Mignolo, that is essentially the whole 19th century notions of Religionswissenschaft, or the study of religion, the science of religion, in continental Europe remains both historically and to a large extent a colonial discipline, one which is derived from what Michel Foucault terms the structures of power knowledge. And these structures of power knowledge are imposed upon cognitive and philosophical traditions of non-Western and indigenous peoples. The article also argues that the archetype of rationality that we take for granted in much of Western scholarship about religion amounts to what Chittister calls a triple mediation. Those are his words. A triple mediation between the imperial domination and colonial classification and administration of subjugated peoples, along with their symbolic practices and cultural memory. One in which, as I argue in the article, has in fact been reinscribed in present day neoliberal fantasies of one world without religion. And the article finally proposes a new deconstructive reading of the theories of religion using post-structuralist instead of Enlightenment methodologies. So let's begin. In his 1971 all-time hit song, Imagine, Beatles singer John Lennon asks us to envision a world without nationalities, war, and private property. In other words, when everyone will be as one. And just about halfway through the song, he asks us to further imagine a world with no religion too, as if the absence of religion were part of this neoliberal fantasy of global oneness. Now, the dreamy promise that we find in this song, which he and his wife Yoko Ono composed at the height of the Vietnam War, was that religion was a kind of enduring source of human conflict throughout history. Now, this is a truism that few scholars or ordinary citizens would go to much length to deny. But the idea played forcefully on the sentiment common in our secular age that if religion, along with those other key divisive factors, were somehow eliminated, the world would come to, quote, live as one. Now, the everyday sentiment behind this vision of a world without religion found its most popular expression in the so-called new atheists of the decades we know as the aughts. And it derives from the radical Enlightenment view that human religiosity is basically an outmoded way of looking at things, a childish predilection, one that must ultimately give way to the exercise of autonomous human rationality. That sensibility was conveyed by Immanuel Kant himself in his definition of enlightenment, or what in the German is called Aufklärung. Literally, this is a translation, release of human beings from their self-incurred immaturity. While this idea was deployed during the late 1970s as an attack on clerical authority, and what the philosophers of that period referred to derogatorily as priestcraft, by the middle decades of the 19th century, the same argument came to serve as a kind of watchword for asserting the cultural and intellectual superiority of the triumphal European colonial powers, as they were gradually spreading their reign of domination over the darker complexioned peoples of the world. As Chittister, in his Genealogy of the Field of Comparative Religion, points out, religiosity throughout the 19th century, quote, was a crucial index for imperial thinking about empire, end quote. That's on page 4 of Empire of Religion. Both the familiar division of the world's religious tradition and the anthropological classification of primitive or indigenous forms of religion, notions which are very commonplace today, developed out of what Chittister described as a triple mediation between imperial domination, colonial superintendence of the bodies and livelihoods of vanquished people, and the cultural memory and symbolic practices of these groups as they were encountered and sought to account for in their intricate and often irreconcilable otherness or alterity. It was out of this triple mediation that even a fourth category of the current analysis that we know as race, Chittister implies, came to be. At the same time, this method of anatomizing the identities of subjugated populations, all of which has the covert aim of neutralizing their political agency under the pretense of what colonialists called Europe's civilizing mission. And this all goes hand in hand with the eradication of what is considered to be their cultural backwardness or savagery. And this was the larger purpose, a kind of omnibus project of 19th century colonialism to enlighten, to eliminate savagery, and to create one world order based on a certain Enlightenment ideal. Enlightenment ideal, which in many ways is embodied in international organizations today. Europeans consider these populations as striking examples of Kant's self-incurred immaturity. And they viewed their own brutal treatment of the subjugated peoples as a necessary pedagogical intervention that would eventually force them to literally grow up. That discipline would be wielded by the new kind of moral Christianity that Kant described as a, quote, religion within the limits of reason alone. In other words, a secular moral religion. As social historians have reminded us for a long while, some kind of unitary religious imaginary is always the crucial solvent for eliminating the clash of civilizations and the class of ethnicities that characterize empires. Now, following Constantine's conversion, Christianity itself provided a temporary ideological cement for an imperial order that in the declining days of the Roman Empire was now no longer sustainable. And the early church, in a sense, reinvented the idea of Romanitas under the notion of what Augustine called the kingdom of God, or excuse me, the city of God. The city of God replaces the notion of the Roman Imperium. It was both religious, but it was also very worldly in a sense. It had a political dimension to it. And this is why the popes of the Middle Ages were always fighting with local monarchs and emperors, particularly the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire, because the question was, who would truly rule? Would it be the sword or would it be the mitre? And the Roman Catholic Church believed that the mitre ultimately held the authority, but it needed the sword. And if the emperors wouldn't, in a sense, follow their dictates, they would wield the sword themselves, which they began to do indirectly in the 14th and 15th century. What Martin Luther considered to be the Babylonian captivity of the church, and this all led to the Protestant Reformation. 3 centuries after Constantine's conversion, Islam, with its cry of Allah, Allah Akbar, managed to reunify for approximately a millennium major portions of the Roman Empire that had been shredded because of civil conflicts and barbarian invasions. Enlightenment rationality an invention largely of landed aristocrats in their struggle with absolute monarchs, became the new unifying secular religion of an expanding, increasing democratic Europe that soon was to rule over the vast majority of humankind until two violent world wars led to its eventual unraveling. Now, it was not Lenin's cloud castle of a religionless world peace, but the divide and conquer strategy of the 19th century imperialists who ruthlessly parceled out the whole of humanity into enlightened and unenlightened souls. That is, advanced or backward races of people in accordance with their carefully contrived constructs as race, intelligence, and national character. All these were considered to be self-evident sociological markers of most academic theorists in the 19th century. All the while, they envisioned for the first time an unprecedented planetary civilization, steeped in the rigorous moral discipline and scientific sophistication of the European overlords, one that would effectively bring about world unity and, by extension, world peace. What we presently refer to as religious differences were far less substantive lines of demarcation prior to the age of imperialism. After all, didn't the Enlightenment, with its dogma of tolerance, initially see these religious differences as inconsequential for the rational education of the human race? Yes, religious differences didn't matter, but racial differences did, because race itself was a kind of indicator of one's backwardness or of one's capacity for enlightenment, maturity. The German word that gets translated as maturity, Mündigkeit, has a lot of interesting kind of connotations. It also means capable of deciding for yourself. In some ways, it even has its own kind of racial overtones, because it says that because it implies that only developed people, whether these are adult Europeans or adult people for whom their secular charges, i.e. the colonized people, that in a sense, to give them agency means you have to give them rationality, which they may or may not have. Technically, they're rational beings, but it's only education that can bring them out. And as we know from 19th century theories of pedagogy, if you spared the rod, you would spoil the child. So, you had to be brutal. You had to oppress. You had to be violent. This is the only way they would learn. They would appreciate the virtues of enlightenment. What I want to do here is explore how such a distinctively modern Western form of rationality became Procrustean bed into which the so-called world religions and the varieties of indigenous religious experiences were forced to lie by a system of colonial domination that its core was cultural, cognitive, and epistemological, as well as political. And so we can see the interconnections between all these aspects of it, the political as well as the cognitive and the epistemological. The theory of how religion is to be organized has to accord with the colonial theory of how the world must, in order to enact the civilizing mission of Europe, be organized as well. So let's look at what I in this article call religion and the colonial differend. Now, differend, that's D-I-F-F-E-R-N-D, is a term that comes from the French philosopher Jean-Francis Lyotard, the same guy who, by the way, invented the term postmodernism. He wrote a book called The Differend. I'm not going to explain Lyotard's theory of the differend, but I want you to keep it in mind as we go forward here. As African philosopher Akele Membe observes in his brilliant analysis of the intimate connection between colonization, capital, and the institution of chattel slavery, colonial governance forced upon the mind of the Enlightenment for the first time a realization of what Kant in his critique of pure reason, had propounded about the finite habitation and radical contingency of the categories of human rationality and self. The architecture of pure reason that had hypnotized the Enlightenment philosophers, that cosmopolitan community of dedicated European, you might say, guardians of knowledge since the Peace of Westphalia, and the revolutionary discoveries of Descartes concerning a mathematical and scientific way of dividing up the world. This all led eventually to a focus not on knowledge in itself, but upon that which produces knowledge, i.e. the human subject. And this is what contemporary philosophers say happened in the 17th, 18th century. For the first time, we have the so-called turn to the subject in the laying out of a theory of epistemology. And this turn to the subject obviously put the subject of knowledge in confrontation with other subjects who didn't have the same knowledge they did. And if they didn't have the same knowledge, particularly what were considered Descartes' pure and distinct rational scientific forms of knowledge, they were considered to be inferior subjects. So it was that kind of epistemological innovation of the Enlightenment, the turn to the subject, that in many ways sketched the framework for colonialism. I'm going to give you a quote from Mbembe, which is in his book, Critique of Black Reason. Quote, "In its avid need for myths through which to justify its power, the Western world considered itself the center of the earth and the birthplace of reason, universal life, and the truth of humanity. The most civilized region of the world, the West alone had invented the rights of the people," quote unquote. "It alone had succeeded in constituting a civil society of nations understood as a public space of legal reciprocity. It alone was at the origin of the idea that to be human was to possess civil and political rights that allowed individuals to develop private and public powers as citizens of the human race, who as such were shaped by all that was human," end quote. This is on page 11 of the Critique of Black Reason. But the cognitive canon of making all ideas clear and distinct, what the Cartesian revolution fabricated, conjured up at the same time a specter of a parallel universe of people and things on the outside of the Enlightenment, who now appeared to be threatening and chaotic. In other words, the savage world peopled by savage minds. The figure of Rousseau's noble savage is a counterfoil to the decadence of the old aristocratic order in the 18th century, now reemerged as a menacing dark double of the post-Napoleonic order of bourgeois civility and political rationality. In other words, Europe now had been modernized, it had been secularized under the Code Napoleon, but that which could not be, that which was dark, that which was in a sense beyond the possibilities of education, this was seen in a whole new light. The age of reason had discovered how to transform itself, no longer by means of some lordly and intuitive contemplation of the interlocking hierarchies of the cosmos as some great chain of being, but through a sheer technology of pure practical reason that succeeded in breaking down and differentiating everything into its most inert and manageable components, leading the English poet William Wordsworth to lament that by adopting this cognitive methodology, quote, "we murder to dissect." Through this process of both the human and material world increasingly became zones of radical indifference, everywhere heaped up with leftovers and detritus as a byproduct of the new theoretically as well as industrially productive machinery. And that which was yet to be ground up by this new industrial productive machinery, that which in a sense had divided the world into the rational and unrational, of course, was the colonial project. Okay, I want to just take a break here, and I'll be right back. Okay, so to go on with talking about Mbembe's theory, that basically what Mbembe is saying is that it was the Enlightenment that offered us a notion of rationalized productivity. And rationalized productivity was based upon a system of relentless differentiation and classification. A process of relentless differentiation and classification that is fortified with the metaphysical certitude of a sovereign and commandeering I, Descartes' I think. And this laid the groundwork for what another post-colonial theorist, Walter Mignolo, is called the colonial difference, which he describes as the idea of a civilizational remainder. In other words, when you rationally add up the totality of everything that is civilized, what is left over? That is what he means by the colonial difference. Let me quote from Mbembe, however. He says in the same book, The Critique of Black Reason, the remainder, the ultimate sign of the dissimilar, of difference and the pure power of the negative, constituted the manifestation of existence as an object. Africa in general and blackness in particular were presented as accomplished symbols of a vegetated limited state. The black man, a sign in excess of all signs and they're fundamentally unrepresentable, was the ideal example of this other being, powerfully possessed by emptiness, for whom the negative had ended up penetrating all moments of existence. The death of the day, destruction and peril, the unnameable night of the world. That's Mbembe's Critique of Black Reason, page 11. So what such a non-negotiable and unrepresentable remainder, as Mbembe calls it, is equivalent to Lyotard's differend. For Lyotard, a differend is an instance of conflict between parties that cannot be resolved by a common rule of judgment. Or, this is a quote from his book, The Differend, which was published in 1988. Quote, where the plaintiff is divested of the means to argue and becomes for that reason a victim, end quote. The voicelessness of the victim came to be inscribed within the syntax of this new commercial industrial apparatus of reason that was the backdrop to the colonial project. Or at minimum, the differend must now speak silently with a lack of certainty that reflects what Lyotard would characterize as the impossibility of joining two heterogeneous genres of discourse, one of which dominates over the other and forces it to interrogate its own way of speaking, even isolating it, perhaps in keeping with Foucault's own method of analysis as a kind of, quote, outer darkness, or at best as a madness, at worst as instinctuality, and a thoroughly ignoble form of insensate savagery. Mbembe's black man, therefore, turns out to be far more than a mere racialized example of the modernist differend. The same figure serves as a trope for a new semiotic system that both overclassifies and overdetermines what we mean by the mysterious other. The racial other, the gender other, but we're not talking identity politics here. We're talking about alterity in general, this sense of otherness. The differential method of post-Enlightenment colonial logic was from the start non-dialectical, disclosing the night side or hidden face of the European Enlightenment. Modernism has always had these two competing points of view, the one tyrannical, which fiercely defends the transcendental standpoint, and the other revolutionary, which aims to overcome it in the taking up the transformation of alterity as a whole into the liberal idea of one world. The tyranny of this kind of logic, which, as we said, has reached its grim consummation in today's neoliberal planetary order, where each one of us has, according to Wendy Brown, has become entrepreneurs of the self, has its genesis in the failure of the immediate heirs of the 18th century philosophers to transform the differend into a new kind of cultural or political subjectivity that would have truly made a concrete universal in Hegel's sense, out of the abstract. It would not have simply ended up with the Jacobin slogan of the rights of humanity, because the rights of humanity now become, in the 19th century, the right to dominate of the abstract Cartesian colonial subject. Instead, modernism triumphed by allowing itself through a new administrative architectures of domination, which in themselves were derived from purely virtual schemes of distinction and classification, derived the luxury of refusing to name what it did not want to assimilate or even to incorporate. Modernism has always been, as Mbembe puts it, quote, the becoming black of the world, end quote. As Alain Badiou, the radical French philosopher, reminds us, the heterotopic use of the figures of blackness rests on its non-dialectical function within a non-commutative constellation of differential signs. I'm going to quote here from Badiou himself in a book which is simply called Black. Quote, black is passive negation. It merely indicates the opposite of its extreme opposite light. The light in the Enlightenment, therefore, has all along overridden a lower, largely imperceptible spectrum of significations and representations that struggle to become visible. But they have been made visible only to the degree that they do not compete with or exceed the clarity of the categories that emanate from the white light of Europe's own regime of critical rationality, end quote. Foremost within this spectrum of representations are those, therefore, that we understand as religious. And remember, we're looking at this whole schema of metaphysical schema, the Cartesian schema, the taxonomy of clear and distinct versus dark, imperceptible, or civilized and savage. And here's where the idea of the religious comes in. If, as Mbembe tells us, Black Africa is the differend defining an impossible negotiation between the illuminated white mentality of colonial Europe and the least of these, as the biblical phrase goes, struggling for dignity and recognition through the invisible remainder of the world, then religion in its original 19th century sense amounts to the differend between Enlightenment reason as a whole and the varieties of culturally embedded forms of self-consciousness within the regimes of colonial difference. And these regimes have to be recognized as enjoying their own sovereignty and autonomy, which conversely and perversely impose their own standard brand of European alterity on a broad spectrum of the world's diverse population. For example, in his infamous polemical put-down of pre-literate peoples of the British Empire, the Victorian anthropologist E.B. Tyler cavalierly insisted that, quote, all evidence shows us that civilized man is not only wiser and more capable than the savage, but also better and happy, quote unquote. Civilized humanity was happier, Tyler insisted, because of its commitment to a universalistic, as opposed to a tribal or particularistic feeling of obligation toward others. In fact, savage forms of spirituality egregiously lacked this universalistic ethic. Quote, one great element of religion, the moral element, which to us forms its vital part, according to Tyler, is indeed little represented in the religion of the lower races. In other words, the moral, rational, i.e. the Kantian dimension of religion is absent. That's when truly what makes religion religion. Religion that is divested of its superstitious, particularistic, or even its tribalistic traits. What we should more properly call the colonial differend is a space of incommensurability within the rhetoric of the human sciences as a whole. And that this rhetoric is effectively becomes the self-articulation of the spiritual positionality of subjugated cultures in relationship to what Tyler referred to as a defined minimum of religion. consisting for the most part in a belief in spirits. Now notice what Tyler calls this a defined minimum of religion. It's a minimum because what it's lacking is the moral or the rational or the universalistic. Tyler called this, quote, minimum animism, which established itself a century and a half ago as a fundamental heuristic construct that underlies the basic nomenclature of the study of religion. As Tyler himself stated in 1871, quote, animism is in fact the groundwork of the philosophy of religion, from that of savages up to that of civilized men, end quote. That's on the remainder of race within the same kind of general anthropology Tyler outlined becomes indistinguishable from the remainder of religion. Both were rhetorically inscribed as minuscule marks of the differential, out of which the integral function of a general all-encompassing humanistic theory, a true humanistic science, could be enunciated. Both came to be considered part of the same black rule of classification that made such grand theory possible in the first place. Both were the crucial rare elements for the construction of a cosmopolitan vision of cultural and spiritual diversity that would make the latter idea of a neoliberal political economy at a global level both plausible and also viable. Now, Tyler's reductive paradigm of animism is the minimal condition for the identification of something we would vaguely call religion. That itself became the secret sauce for the development throughout the 20th century of a certain disciplinary approach that was known as religious studies. Now, the approach, which we know today we're quite familiar with both diachronous, that is reaching back in time, and synchronous, that is horizontally extending in all contemporary cases. The synchronous methodology was sustained through a variety of fanciful names: comparativism, phenomenology of religion, cross-cultural study of religion, and so forth. It claimed to be embroiled in some kind of scientific endeavor to discover the essential, if not variable, structures of an underlying, that is, unitary phenomena that could be described as religion in general. Perhaps starting from the assumption that there was some epitome, some paradigmatic form, what Durkheim called totemism, that could be teased out from the welter of empirical observations that would somehow serve as the philosopher's stone for turning irrational modes of spiritual discourse into a rational and holistic language properly representing the human condition as a whole, which of course has been the goal of what in French is called the religious sciences, what in German is called Religionswissenschaft, and what we call religious studies. Most of these procedural maps relied on what David Hume in the 18th century had dubbed the natural history of religion. But they were mere thought experiments or speculative ventures, since most of the data about religious beliefs and practices from the past were found almost exclusively in barely intelligible ancient texts, most of which had been written in languages that European scholars were just only beginning to translate. These speculative archetypes frequently were supported by evidence gathered from classicists, or they were made from extrapolations to a more distant past from the consideration of the contemporary beliefs or practices of, quote, backward people who had to be, because of their moral and epistemological inferiority, subject to the laws of colonial administration. Toward the end of the 19th century, social Darwinism also came to play a significant role in the elaboration of these speculative structures, insofar as Tyler's moral religiosity was seen as somehow now enshrined in the apex of a complex yet inevitable trajectory of religious evolution from blind savagery to Anglican high church communion. Now let's talk a little bit about what Tomoko Masuzawa has called inventing world religions and how this fits in with Chittister's approach. As Mazuzawa emphasizes, quote, the modern discourse on religion and religions was from the very beginning, that is to say, inherently, if also ironically, a discourse of secularization. So here we see that the discourse of religions is an Enlightenment discourse. It's a discourse that is tied in intimately with colonialism through its praxis of rationalization and clarification and categorization, and also creating hierarchies of types to fit what we would call the neo-Cartesian way of looking at things. But more importantly, Mazuzawa says, this modern discourse on religion was clearly, quote, a discourse of othering. And note that, it was a discourse of othering. For Mazuzawa, the protocols of othering resolved around eliminating the native discourses that came to be called religious as illustrations of the differend. If these discourses were to be in any way meaningful and acceptable, they could no longer be coded by their own system of accounting or within their own inherent semantic system. Rather, they had to be translated into the language of science or objective registers of rationality. That was true. That was the true categorical imperative of the movement that fancied itself eventually as the science of religion. Furthermore, the imperative came to be applied to both the historical and structural modalities of inquiry into the nature of religion. The scientific study of religion rested on the cardinal premise that religion was incapable of speaking for itself, as was also the case, not coincidentally, of the colonized themselves. They were not capable of speaking in their own voice. They had to be spoken for. Mazuzawa writes, quote, my suspicion naturally is that some deep symmetry and affinity obtained between these two wings of the religion discourse, that they can jointly enable this discourse to do the vital work of churning the stuff of Europe's ever-expanding epistemic domain and of forging from that ferment an enormous apparition, the essential identity of the West. So the whole notion of religious studies of comparative religions as a rational enterprise tied to the colonial project, even if we don't mean anymore 19th century colonialism, we mean the new form of colonialism we call neoliberalism. That is essentially what religious studies has said. Edward Said, of course, as another post-colonial theorist, recognized the covert agenda of othering under the guise of objective scholarship in the project he baptized as Orientalism. And as we're well aware about the history of religions, and quite recently, it has been propelled by numerous variations on the Orientalist theme. In the same way that the phenomenology of religion had carried through a subtler and more sophisticated strand of Tyler's project by reducing all religiosity to its most original component. What Max Müller called mana, Rudolf Otto called the numinous, or Gerhard of Vanderlave termed power. These are in a sense the different formulations of the essential minimum define what we mean by religion. And they are reductive in this sense, but they're reductive because they want to and sometimes retain some kind of semblance of rationality, even though it is only a potential rationality that can be massaged and brought out through the discourse of critical enlightenment reason ventured by religious studies. But what if this ongoing effort to achieve some kind of observer-neutral stance toward the varieties of religious representation, or to even recognize the authentic self-representation of subjugated personalities, did not turn out to be the quintessence of the European imperial thrust overall? The fundamental problem of any theory of religion or religions has always been called the insider-outsider dichotomy. If what a religious person says about the world as they see and articulate it is not to be taken for granted, but somehow be filtered through a scientized lens, does not that amount to a different kind of colonization, perhaps what we might call cognitive colonization. So I'm asking the question, is that what we're really doing in religious studies? Are we not, in a sense, performing as cognitive colonialists? Certainly that was Frantz Fanon's argument in Black Skin, White Masks. His argument mirrored with far more psychoanalytic precision the suggestion that the early American or African American radical and social reformer W.B. Du Bois had set forth a half century earlier about Black people suffering from a double consciousness that rendered them incapable of mediating between their own experience and the discursive hegemony of white culture and the internalized gaze of their former slave owners. Du Bois wrote that in 1903. Both Du Bois and Fanon recognized that this off-sided Marxian dialectic of master and slave, which we find in Hegel's phenomenology of spirit, were recognition by the other, or what Hegel calls the certainty of self-consciousness, is finally achieved through labor and struggle at the expense of the ruling class. Now this dialectic, according to Du Bois, failed in the case of racial and by extension religious structures of domination. The Marxist vision of history foresaw both a dialectical, if not an eschatological, overturning of the relationship between lord and bondsman, or slave. The German word actually is Knecht. It's a somewhat archaic term that means mostly a serf. So we'll say between lord and serf, in which, quote, and this is a quote from Marx, the first will be last and the last will be first, which is also a quote from Jesus. Yet both Du Bois and Fanon conceived that the racialized template of mastery and bondship is more an inscrutable kind of undecidable as a differend. The so-called politics of recognition, as it's come to be called, which can be traced back to Alexander Kojève's reading of Hegel and has been a staple of the so-called identity politics, corresponds to, in truth, to what Glenn Coulthard summarizes as a kind of crypto-colonial control. The self-representation of the colonized who fight for their own pride of place or self-certainty are only allowed to utilize the sorts of constitutive conceptual tools supplied by the colonizer. Very often, as we find in the indigenous rights movement, involving land claims against private interests, as well as the state that in the past seized and stole land from so-called First Nations that inhabited these vast continents that are now settled by Westerners. The representational apparatus that guarantees self-recognition is derived from an alien body of law, religion, and socio-historical taxonomies that were imposed and erased the native communitarian sensibilities of the conquered by the conquerors. In fact, I'm going to be, one of my PhD advisees is defending a dissertation this very Friday, which shows how exactly this whole process has worked, particularly in terms of what we might call the appropriation of native indigenous spirituality by the enlightened New Age establishment. The politics of recognition, as it's been called, or what Charles Taylor, who seems to have given currency to the expression, is called the politics of equal dignity, turns out to be a giant scam that rigs the rules in favor of those who already possess the proper rhetorical competence to identify and implement any kinds of indigenous rights or entitlements. The politics of recognition, therefore, become a kind of political theology that permit no negotiation within the semiotic reference frame of those who begin with their own customs, traditions, and worldview. As Coulthard remarks, instead of ushering in an era of peaceful coexistence grounded on the ideal of reciprocity or mutual recognition, the politics of recognition in its contemporary liberal form promises to reproduce the very configurations of colonialist, racist, patriarchal state power that indigenous peoples' demands for recognition have historically sought to transcend, end quote. And by the way, this argument about the politics of recognition you can find in chapter 6, you can find a much more extensive argument, chapter 6 of my book, Neoliberalism and Political Theology, from Kant to Identity Politics. So affirmation of indigeneity thus appears to have come down to a Hobson's choice, that is, to a false choice, either acquiesce to and formalize as a matter of common cultural coinage the representational system of the colonizer and granting recognition to the colonized, who is unrecognized, so far as any kind of reciprocal form of signification is possible. The theme to be highlighted here is that historically the study of religion has inescapably held out this very Hobson's choice with regard to the narrative and material artifacts of those religious traditions it purports to investigate in a seemingly neutral or disinterested fashion. In order to speak for themselves, the bearer and advocates of any kind of autonomous religiosity have been compelled to opt out of transposing their own messages into the appropriate common language in which not only the history of religions, but also what is popularly known as interreligious dialogue is routinely insinuated. They are also then refused the right to speak except in terms that are automatically disregarded as unintelligible within the operative idiom of the field itself. We are thus left, if one wants to speak for oneself in religious studies, one is left as simply Lyotard's differend, as the indivisible remainder, which could say it's also the invisible remainder. And in this context, it means little more than a denial of access to voices from the dark underworld of religious consciousness that is not distinctly Greco-European. Now, according to Mazuzawa, the system of religious differentiation, which the history of religions or the science of religions invented, was not only an instrument of social and political administration, it was also a means of dealing with the paradoxical claims of the contested segments within this differential spectrum, as well as trying to decide what is the source of legitimation? How do we negotiate among these claims from some standpoint of pure reason? Mazuzawa makes the obvious point that there really is no such thing when it comes to devotion and religious practice as pure polytheism, which in itself only becomes meaningful from an administrative perspective. The very idea of polytheism was in fact invented by the Romans in order to understand religion and ethnicity and tribalism as basically one and the same. Certain people may follow more than one true God, but some divinities are more true and authenticated than others. And for practical purposes, any kind of spiritual endeavor involves a mobilization of singular energies and loyalties. The penchant of Enlightenment thinkers for detailing a science of religion aided 19th and 20th century researchers, according to Mazuzawa, in circumventing the paradox of competing religious absolutism. So, for example, how does one mediate between the Shema in the Hebrew Bible, the first commandment, hear, O people of Israel, the Lord is one, or how does that come to terms with the opening of the Quran about the one absolute God whose name is Allah? The whole notion of polytheism, she says, was a way of maintaining a certain privileged theological position while claiming to have transcended theology through the subterfuge of declaring a secret principle of e pluribus unum, that is, out of the many comes one that was purely empirical rather than confessional in nature. That principle was the idea that now we're familiar with, and we call it religious pluralism. It is conceivable, however, Mazuzawa writes, quote, that this very threshold of the new discourse of religious pluralism may be bewitched, end quote. It is bewitched by its own crypto-confessional commitments masquerading as objective, that is, as colonial knowledge about religion. Here's what Mazuzawa says, quote unquote, and this is from her book, The Inventions of World Religions. It's on page 327. What is at stake here is far more fundamental than the problem of border violations between historical science and theology. Rather, it is a question of whether the world religions discourse can in any way be enlisted and trusted on the side of historical scholarship. Or put another way, whether the idea of the diversity of religion is not Instead, the very thing that facilitates the transference and transmutation of a particular absolutism from one context to another, from the overtly exclusivistic hegemonic version, that is Christian supremacist dogmatism, to the openly pluralistic universalistic one, world religions pluralism, and at the same time makes this process of transmutation very hard to identify and nearly impossible to understand, end quote. So the very concept of world religions, as well as the science of religion, presupposes a special mode of background cognition that often goes unrecognized in the field that is generically known as religious studies. That cognition, if we follow the philosopher Husserl, may be called pre-theoretical. And it's in a format that corresponds within the political realm to the priority of empire. Thus, Chittister's empire of religion is largely indistinguishable from the new global empire of signs, delineating the emergent neoliberal imperium of virtualized capital, which, in the words of Wendy Brown, quote, transforms homo politicus into homo economicus, into signs of exchange. In other words, religions become commodities exchangeable through the new kind of general currency that we call religious studies. Although the term neoliberal has acquired a multitude of sometimes confusing meanings since it started to be used a few quarter century ago, I'm implying it here less as a signifier of free market capitalism and more in terms of what Nancy Fraser refers to as a progressive form of social and cultural hegemony that serves the economic interests of the new global educated elites. As I argue in my new book, the neoliberal globalist imperium has taken on the so-called civilizing mission of European colonialism in the 19th century. Indeed, modernism in the epistemological format that we know as postmodernism consists in the theoretical manifestation of the colonial project. According to Walter Mignolo, quote, coloniality is constitutive of modernity. There is no modernity without coloniality. Today's coloniality relies more on the algorithms of high finance and the social scientific imprimaturs of government granting agencies and gunboats and missionaries. But the effect is, by and large, the same. Hence, Mignolo says, quote, today's common expression, global modernities imply global colonialities, which imply also, and this is a gloss of mine, imply globalized virtual commodities, in the precise sense that the colonial matrix of power is shared and disputed by many contenders. There cannot be modernity without coloniality. There cannot either be global modernities without global colonialities. And of course, one has to have a global apparatus of free trade where these different colonialities and virtual signifying commodities can be easily exchanged and can have a certain value or price depending on the particular spiritual needs of the Western consumer. The colonial matrix of power is, according to Mignolo, is the formal limitation of the possibility of what and how something can be represented, especially when what is represented happens to be what traditionally has been considered as unrepresentable, that is, the one true God or the supreme power of the universe. Now, the colonial matrix of power, as Mignolo demonstrates, also defines what might be regarded as equivalent to the European parameters of rationality. In his essay entitled Philosophy and the Colonial Difference, Foucault emphasized knowledge and power always work together. Mignolo underscores how the dominant rationalistic milieu in which science, scholarship, jurisprudence, and other approaches providing covering theories for phenomena under construction was built around the historical prestige of Western philosophy, beginning with the Greek. The categorical scheme of Western thought, what Derrida in his famous essay called White Mythology, had its genesis in an alphabetic constellation of writing, according to Mignolo, that gave us the logic of predication and also precision when it comes to drawing lines between categories. a condition that would have been different if philosophy had somehow been birthed from languages such as Chinese, Egyptian, or even Aztec, Nahuatl. It was this categorical scheme that also provided the justification of political as well as cultural domination that manifested in the historical epic we know as Western colonialism. Present-day theoretical positions, so far as Mignolo is concerned, must become rigorously aware of this presuppositional fabric in which they are profoundly embedded. As Mignolo says, quote, "The cards are on the table. Indeed, it is the case that we must recognize that Western philosophy in its operative model of pure reason happens to be, quote, a regional and historical practice initiated in Greece and taken up by and in the making of Europe from the Renaissance to the Enlightenment. Coupled with religious and economic expansion, philosophy becomes the yardstick by which other ways of thinking are measured. Perspectives have been changing, and now philosophy is located on the edge of the colonial difference." End quote. If any plausible science of religion or religious studies or any other derivative of Western philosophical thinking is thus likewise situated on the edge of colonial difference, then what does this mean for both present and future theoretical perspectives and what we understand as religiosity overall? How do we theorize without the theoretical dead end that is Lyotard's different? We cannot necessarily fall back on what Mignolo himself regards as the alternative, namely what he calls the decolonial option, which in a sense is a kind of cultural and cognitive succession from the global secular order. The decolonial option is by and large the refusal of theory in its broader meaning, as well as a kind of what he calls a preferential option, to allow the colonized to speak on their own and to speak in their own way, regardless of whether the West understands it or not. To speak in the distinctive voice as a reciprocal gesture of inclusion, which at the same time does not demand an explanation. The decolonial option, he said, therefore, has to therefore be set again, radically set against, seen as a non-dialectical alternative to the hegemonic discourse of Western and by extension colonial scientism. Mignolo explains the decolonial option as follows. I'm going to give you a long quote here that I think is instructive. He says, "I argue that one of the defining features of the decolonial options is the analytic of the construction, transformation, and sustenance of racism and patriarchy that created the conditions to build and control a structure of knowledge, either grounded on the word of God or the word of reason and truth. Such knowledge construction made it possible to eliminate or marginalize what did not fit into these principles that aspired to bring a totality in which everybody would be included, but not everybody would have the right to include. Inclusion is a one-way street and not a reciprocal right. In a world governed by the colonial matrix of power, he who includes and she who is welcome to be included stand in codified power relations. The locus of enunciation from which this inclusion is established is always a locus hiding the control of knowledge and the power of decision across gender and racial lines, across political orientations and economic regulations," end quote. This is from a published article of Mignolo's in 2011. Religious theory thus reverts to its own measure of a theological Grundrisse, that is what Marx called a Grundrisse, a kind of underlying scaffolding or framework, a kind of liberation theology in its own right that calls into question the universal applicability of theory overall, at least in the sense with which most scholars are familiar. The decolonial option, in turn, turns out to be a refusal of any genuine global perspective on the pre-theoretical significance of the dimension of human experience, along with the symbolic transactions that mediated from one culture to another. It is in effect both a negative theology and a liberation theology, all wrapped up in one package, one which exposes the inherent limitations of the study of religion as we understand it, but is incapable of coming to terms with a viable project of mediation that would allow us to signal intelligibly back and forth between the colonial and the decolonial, or at least to go beyond the imperial grammar of distinction that has dominated today's scholarly way of talking. When all is said and done, the decolonial option as an answer to colonial difference simply yields to the silence of the different. The view of the religious factor in the history of civilization is either a pre-theoretical placeholder to be filled in exclusively through the linguistic expansionism of rationality, or as a kind of surd that can only be deciphered by those insiders for whom have privileged access to what it really means. That distinction is really a bogus distinction. It's a false dichotomy. Certainly post-colonial and decolonial critiques of the schematism employed by academics into the nature of religion have served well to deprive them of the absolutist stature they once enjoyed. At the same time, the radical secularist idea, as captured in Lenin's song of a world polity or world civilizational matrix of common knowledge shorn of all religion, proves itself to be just as much a dangerous fantasy. Such a vision of a planetary secular cosmopolis, as the historian Quincy Bodian shows in ferocious detail, was heir to the 19th century ideal of Europe's civilizing mission to the undeveloped peoples of the world and formed the background of the new post-nationalist and post-socialist system of global governmentality, as Foucault would call it in the 1970s. The system of governmentality based on the expansion of consumer capitalism, a system that has come in recent decades to be known as neoliberalism. Neoliberalism, in Slobodian's immortal words, has always envisioned, quote, a world of people without a people. It has sought to create a post-colonial world order that replaces the discipline of the military conqueror and bureaucratic functionary with the pricing mechanism of the global marketplace and the appeal to the cosmopolitan sensibility of inclusion from the top to the bottom, rather than from the bottom to the top. At the level of governance, the same neoliberal regime relies on mechanisms of abstraction such as commodification of desire through advertising, the quantification along with the financialization of all kinds of human capital, especially in this enterprise we call higher education, and the virtualization of all forms of mutual human recognition through identity politics and the proliferating use of social media. It's become what Patrick Deneen terms an anti-culture masquerading as a configuration of empowering human knowledge. This globalized neoliberal template has also absorbed our commonsensical view of the religious. Religion is no longer what Robert Bellah once defined as, quote, a set of symbolic forms and acts that relate man to the ultimate conditions of existence, one which is unconditionally grounded in the primordial consciousness of human beings while motivating them to exceptional acts of self-renunciation or fidelity to others. Rather, it becomes simply one more behavioral trait or immaterial cultural artifact that can be classified within a socio-historical political grid of supposed neutral knowledge that tacitly carries within itself a disposition toward moral judgment. For example, there is scarcely any real distinction between the Victorian savant who dispassionately pronounces the rights of an African bush people savage or degenerate, and a 20th century person of letters who considers himself or herself politically correct or sufficiently woke to view the same phenomenon as the product of misrecognition through the Eurocentric eyes of incorrigible whiteness. Both moral judgments are inseparable from the prevailing sentimentality of the ruling classes, whether they be colonialist or neoliberal. In reality, the real colonial difference is one that does not really matter. The notion that the religious in its most enigmatic implications can somehow be scrubbed down to manipulate data sets is one gray manifestation of what we might call the neoliberal obsession. Neoliberal epistemology requires a mathematization, I should say, or what Bernard Stiegler has described as grammatization of every vague representation and perceptual emblems with incalculable symbolic density. The fanaticism of classifying that was brought to us by the colonialists, which applied just as well to native spiritual practices as to types of skulls, does not have to draw its schematism from Anglican high church sacramentalism or any kind of Kantian metaphysic of morals. It can just as easily come from the most cosmopolitan of cross-cultural and pluralist sensibilities, which ultimately aim to enumerate a surplus of equally valorized fragments of difference for the sake of demonstrating their conceptual identity in the sense of this is what religion truly is. All things considered, therefore, Chittister's triple mediation becomes its own brand of a triple bind, where we are often caught between our own anxiety about exploiting or appropriating the positionalities of non-European peoples so that we might shore up our own advantaged versions, and conceding that we have no business engaging in such theoretical ventures in the first place, or deferring to the ultimate neoliberal goal of a world without religion, at least a world where religion only marginally matters, if at all. In many respects, the bindedness of such mediation is dependent on the protocols of Western scholarship itself, with its lens of white mythology for catching sight of the world. Such a bindedness is intertwined with a false assumption that knowledge itself must be double or triple blind. The knowing that we regard as scientific in such a way that our knowledge of religion is transformed into a science of religion can never become a mere objective theme in the crudest sense of the world. Any science, as Husserl understood, must be ensconced within a medium of self-reflection that discloses its own transcendental starting point. And that's where we have to begin. It is a position where we now have neither a science, as Husserl says, that discloses its own transcendental starting point. It is a position where we now have neither a science that we accept nor a world that exists for us. Instead of simply existing for us, that is, being accepted naturally by our own experiential believing in the existence of the world is for us something that claims being, end quote. Nevertheless, what we construe as religious representations can truly claim a reality that can be made meaningful outside the signifying matrix of Chittister's empire of religions. And I emphasize that this empire of religion is ultimately an empire of differential science. When we're talking about Chittister's empire of religion, Masazawa's invented his story of religions from Mignolo's colonial difference. We're all talking about basically the same thing. The conceptual baseline for such an undertaking would have to make use of the post-structural or deconstructive linguistic tools at our disposal. In the meantime, we as Western scholars, and therefore I'm going to conclude with these remarks, must admit that we find ourselves in a kind of predicament similar to what Max Muller found in the 18th century, when he said that religion is nothing more than a stuttering effort not to comprehend, but to apprehend the infinite. It is one Nietzsche himself described about the same time when imperial European scientism claimed to have reached its zenith. This is from his Gay Science, written in the 1870s, quote, "We have left the land and have embarked. We have burned our bridges behind us. Indeed, we have gone farther and destroyed the land behind us," end quote. At the same time, as in Nietzsche's aphorism, we must discover the ocean on which we ourselves find does not always roar. Instead, quote, "it lies out like silk, spread out like silk and gold in reveries of graciousness." That is perhaps how the forms of religion we study appear to us. But as Nietzsche quips, hours will come when you will realize that it is infinite and there is nothing more awesome than infinity. It is this realization that when we are studying religion, we are not, in a sense, classifying things that are easy at hand that can be broken down into abstract systems of classification, but the realization that in a sense we are, as William Blake said, hold infinity in the palm of our hand. It is a realization that makes us realize we require an even bigger imagination than John Lennon himself could have imagined. And I'm going to stop there.